Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington, and on Thursday in Kyrgyzstan, President Bakiyev left for Kyrgyzstan, a popular revolt nipping at his heels. Kyrgyzstan was a former republic of the Soviet Union 19 years ago, and now is one of the poorest countries in the region. 40% of the Kyrgyz population lives below the poverty line, unemployment at a staggering 18%, the world's 16th highest rating, along with 10% inflation rate. In 2007, 27% of its GDP, $322 million, was sent as remittances from Kyrgyz working abroad, mostly in Russia. But in 2008, those remittances dropped by half as a result of the recession. In the midst of this post-tulip revolution, some people are calling it Tulip Revolution 2, Bakiyev leaves for Kyrgyzstan, and what is left behind is a new government that has on its ground a Russian military base and a US military base, the only country host to bases from both countries. Now joining us to help us understand what happened there is F. William Engdahl. He's the author of the book Full Spectrum Dominance, Totalitarian Democracy in the New World Order, and he joins us from Frankfurt, Germany. Thanks for joining us again, William.
Thank you, Paul.
So first of all, talk a little bit about why Kyrgyzstan is so important strategically.
Well, if we pull out a map and look at the location of Kyrgyzstan in Eurasia, and specifically in Central Asia, it begins to become very clear. For one, it shares over a 500-mile-long border with China, not only with China, but one of the most politically sensitive parts of far western China, namely Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur riots took place last summer of '09, and where most of the energy, oil and gas pipelines coming from the west, from Russia, from Kazakhstan, into the Chinese economy flow through. So the Chinese are extremely concerned about stability on the Kyrgyzstan border. Number two, it's adjacent to Kazakhstan, which is one of the major energy supply sources for China as well as for Central Asia. And Chevron, of course, has a big interest in the oil fields of Kazakhstan, as do the Chinese. And Russia has a major stake, of course, in Kyrgyzstan. It's a former Soviet republic and was only declared independent in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved. So that and its location, its proximity to Afghanistan, makes the landlocked and extremely poor country, the mountainous country Kyrgyzstan, one of the geopolitical chess pieces in a major game of balance of power between Russia, China, and the United States, especially the United States versus the Russian and Chinese side.
Now, Bakiyev had not ingratiated himself with the Russians in the last few years. He negotiated a deal, apparently, with the Russians that would exclude the U.S. Air Force Base. And then after making the deal with the Russians, he went and made another deal with the Americans anyway. How does all this play out in terms of what has just transpired?
Bakiyev owed his job to Washington. Washington surprised Moscow in 2005 on the heels of the Georgia and Ukrainian color revolutions that they financed, and financed a successful revolution to put Bakiyev into power called the Tulip Revolution. The U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, the State Department, all the usual players were involved in that. And Bakiyev was touted as a great Democrat. He was anything but. And he stuffed his government, his regime with relatives and cronies. Then Russia, being extremely nervous about the U.S. airbase at Manas and the potential for problems coming from the U.S. Central Command stationed in Kyrgyzstan, they, in 2009, offered a $2 billion, or a little bit more than a $2 billion credit to the Kyrgyz government of Bakiyev on the proviso that they close the Manas U.S. landing rights. Well, Bakiyev made a horse trade with Washington, who came back and tripled their $20 million a year rental for the air landing rights for the U.S. Air Force, but they also channeled the $60 million plus all sorts of other amenities into a private company, an airport authority, which was run by Bakayev's own son, his own family members. So the money that the U.S. Paid, the 300% rent increase, went directly into lining the pockets of Bakayev and his relatives.
This is the same son that owns a piece of the Blackpool Football Club in England.
It is, yeah. This is Maxim, who at the time of the opposition events of April 7th was on his way to Washington for a presentation on the investment opportunities in Kyrgyzstan, where he's head of the national investment authorities, and playing a key role in privatizing the telecommunications, all sorts of other things. And just so happens that they've been privatized into the hands of friends of the Bakayev family in places like the Cayman Islands, which do no good to the economy of Kyrgyzstan. So there was quite a bit of domestic resentment against Bakayev and family.
Yeah, many people are wondering why it took so long for such a revolt to develop, given how overt the kleptocracy was. But this is a kleptocracy that had been nurtured not just under the Bush administration, but nurtured again under the Obama administration.
I think the reason that this event succeeded, and this is speculative on my part, but I've got it from fairly well-informed Russian sources as well, is that the opposition led by the former foreign minister Rosa Otunbayeva, the opposition had more than a little bit of help on the ground from very sophisticated Russian friends. Let's leave it at that. But I think earlier attempts at protests and peaceful demonstrations and so completely failed. This time, they had the advantage that there had been a 400% increase in the telecommunication, electricity, heating, and other essential public utility costs, and those were going into these private companies that were owned by friends of Basayev. That took place in March, so that triggered the first wave of demonstrations. But then this time, if you look at the details of the events that unfolded in the space of literally 2 to 3 days between the 7th and 8th of April, it worked with uncanny efficiency, and to the point where the army, the command of the army was won over to the side of the opposition. The command of the national police was won over to the side of the opposition, and the command of the border guards, so that they had military and police control of the country within 48 hours. And that suggests a very, very carefully planned and sophisticated operation. And I would not be at all surprised if the telephone calls between Putin and the opposition in those days of last week were involving much more than just warm words of support.
And it's been publicly acknowledged that Putin was the first foreign leader to call after the, I don't know, I guess you'd call it a coup, a revolution.
Yep.
And Putin has already offered millions of dollars of support to the new government. Now, the Americans are in a position of having to support the new government too. Bakayev is gone. They want to keep their base, but the Russians clearly had previously wanted the base to go. So in the next segment of our interview with F. William Engdahl, let's talk about what might happen next and what it means to the chessboard game in this region filled with oil and gas and of great strategic importance. Please join us again with F. William Engdahl on the Real News Network.